there. Same day. Thought that I would see about finishing Mountains of Spices today. I'm on chapter 17. Chapter 18 is rather long, but I'm going to go ahead and do chapter 17, Mountain of Aloes, which is the spirit of self-control. And the subtitle is, one moment, Self-Controlled by Love. There came a day soon after this when Grace and Glory was led to the last of the 9 mountains of spices, which was the Mountain of Aloes. This completed the whole circle of lovely peaks and brought her right back again to the edge of the Mountain of Pomegranates from which they had first started. This last mountain was, she thought, in some ways, the most beautiful of them all. Although all 9 were so fair and wonderful, it was really difficult to favor one above the rest. Indeed, they all belonged together as the range of gardens in which the king grew his own wonderful spices. The Mountain of Aloes and the Mountain of Pomegranates possessed one feature, however, which did distinguish them in a special way from the other mountains in the chain. Between them lay a very quiet valley, through which flowed a river of crystal clear water. This valley was, as it were, the stairway up to the very high places above. The river flowed across the valley between the 2 mountains after descending in a waterfall from the cliffs high up on the Mountain of Aloes. On the upper side of the quiet valley above the river was a path which led up and out of this world altogether into the upper regions of the sky. At times, some of the inhabitants of those upper regions came down to the further banks of the river in order to welcome across to the other side those of the king's friends for whom the time for departure from the earth had come. On this occasion, however, it was not the quiet valley between the mountains that the king led Grace and Glory, but to the Mountain of Aloes itself. Here grew the aloe trees of self-control. Lign. I don't know what that is. I'll have to look that up. Aloe trees of self-control. They were very great trees, giants of strength and loveliness. Beside them, even the tallest of forest trees appeared as dwarfs. Their trunks were of immense thickness, their branches spread out gloriously, shading an area vast enough to shelter a cathedral. Also, they were magnificently proportioned and were crowned with a gracefully vaulted roof of foliage so thick that not a drop of rain or hail could penetrate to the cool, shady depths beneath. The trees did not grow close together, but were widely spaced apart over the slopes of the mountain, each one rising like a noble and gracious temple, in the shadowy depths of which chanted the melodious choir of birds. The spice yielded by these mighty trees was obtained by stripping off the perfumed bark from the great trunks of the trees. The bark grew again so quickly that the stripping process could be repeated several times each year, and it always resulted in the further strengthening and growth of the trees. To sit down in the shade of one of these great temple-like trees was quite an awesome, awe-inspiring experience. But as soon as they were seated, Grace and Glory noticed the squirrels were frisking about on the branches as gaily as children at play, and birds were nesting and twittering above her head. Indeed, whole families of happy creatures appeared to have made their homes in the all-embracing shelter of the tree. If at first It reminded her of the solemn beauty and worship of a cathedral or temple. She soon discovered that it was a temple of joy and lively happiness. She sat admiring with almost reverential awe the graciously proportioned boughs spreading overhead, so nobly strong and so harmonious in their loveliness. It all made upon her a great impression of goodness and beauty and strength made perfect. As she gazed around in awed delight, she found herself wondering what the aloe trees must be like which grew up in the very high places. If these on this side of the river grew such magnificent and unique proportions. Presently, from the other aloe trees on the slopes around her, she heard voices singing, as though invisible choirs were chanting together in mystic harmonies, a song of great joy and almost inexpressibly glorious melody. Love has made a marriage feast, called each wedding guest, rich and poor, greatest and least, all at love's behest, gathered here to celebrate the harvest of his joy, so great. See the king's son with his bride, wooed and now possessed. Here, behold her at his side, in his glory dressed. This is what he chose for her, to be his forevermore. Love has triumphed, love has won. Fruit from sorrow this, all he purposed he has done. She is wholly his. All her heart and all her soul yielded to his full control. After the song had died away into silence, the king and his companion sat quite silently, looking out from the slope of the mountain onto the view spread out before them. There were the long, long chains of mountains and the far-reaching valleys which Grace and Glory had seen from the Mountain of Frankincense. Only on this Mountain of Aloes the air seemed even clearer, and they could see further and more distinctly the far-off places of the earth where love was not known and where he found no response, therefore, to his own love. Grace and Glory looked out over those low places for a long time. Then she turned in silence and looked at the king. She was wondering why he said no more to her about those many, many valleys and the multitudes of wandering and fainting people who lived in them. Now, as she looked up into his face with the question in her eyes, which her lips did not frame, he turned on her a most radiant smile and said, "It is nearly time, Grace and Glory, but the plan is not yet quite ready for fulfillment." She thought it sounded as though he were laughing to himself over some happy secret. But after a moment he changed the subject and said, "The trees on this mountain are the trees of self-controlled by love. They are the most fully developed and most perfectly proportioned trees up here on the high places, and the secret of their development lies in the fact that their great roots spread out underground far beyond the spread of their branches overhead. Each of these lovely giants sends at least some of its roots down into the waters of the river of life, which you see flowing through the valley, and which has come down from the very high places above." "Self-controlled by love," repeated Grace and Glory thoughtfully. "My lord, I am always asking you questions which you answer so patiently and with such loving kindness. May I ask another? What is a self?" "A self, or individual, will, is a marvelous mystery," said the king. "For an individual will is really part of the will and consciousness of the Creator himself, a part which he has made free, so that it knows itself to be distinct in some lovely and mysterious way from all other individual wills, even from the will of the Creator who sent it forth. But it is so shaped and fashioned that it yearns back instinctively and with unquenchable longing for reunion with that from which it came forth. It is a capacity to love and is therefore a spark of the eternal fire of holy love, and so it can never find rest or real satisfaction until, like the leaping sparks which fall back into the fire apart from which they cannot continue to exist, it finds the way back to the heart of God from whom it came forth. It is a ceaseless hunger and thirst which, turn wherever it will for satisfaction, can find none till it responds to the attracting pull of the eternal being of self from which it came forth. As long as it turns away from the source of its origin, it is like a wandering star or a lost meteor until it falls back into the heart of love and yields up its own right to self-control. A human spirit is indeed a capacity to love and to respond to love, and according to what it chooses or wills to love, so will its woe or blessedness be. Here's a song of love's origin. Love is a glory and a pain. It is a burning fire, a flame of life which ne'er again can cease to know desire. For love from the eternal flame came forth and bears his lovely name. Love kindled in a human heart is but a single spark of love divine, now set apart and launched into the dark. It no fulfillment knows, nor peace, till from its own self-love it cease. As every spark from love's own fire the self-same nature shares, it yearns back with intense desire to him whose name it bears. So leaps it forth in love and greets all other flaming souls it meets. Yes, oneness is the heart of love to burn alone, despair. One with its source in God above, all men everywhere. It burning heavenward wears Christ's face and is on earth his dwelling place. As soon as this song ended, the lovely but invisible choirs among the aloe trees again began to sing, but in a language which grace and glory could scarcely understand, which yet had something strangely and exquisitely familiar about it, as of a language heard long, long ago in earliest childhood, then heard no more, and long since forgotten. Now, as she heard it again, it stirred in her heart sweet, haunting memories, and such poignant nostalgia that the sweetness of it became almost unbearable. Presently, however, the music of the choirs became softer and sank to a low accompaniment, and then one voice, lovelier than any she had ever heard, save that of the king himself, began to sing alone. At first she thought it was an angel, then perhaps the first mother of all men. But then, as she caught the words, she understood that it was the voice of the queen herself, the bride of the King of Love. My bonds are very, very strong. I never can go free. To holy love I now belong, and he belongs to me. And all the power of earth and heaven into my love-chained hands is given. Controlled by him, I choose. But this control is my delight, and freedom I refuse. The King of love as Lord I own, and sit with him upon his throne. And that's the end of chapter 17. Chapter 18, last scene on the mountains of spices. Sometime after the events recorded in these chapters, there was a feast day up on the high places. A number of the inhabitants of the Valley of Humiliation had gathered with the king on the Mountain of Aloes. Among them were some whom you will recognize. Mrs. Valiant was there with her daughter Mercy and her son-in-law Fearless Trust. Her friend, Mrs. Thanksgiving, was sitting beside her, and with her were her two daughters, her niece, Grace and Glory, and her son, Fearless Witness, who was head and shoulders taller than any of those present. Already he bore on his face and hands many scars received while witnessing for his Lord and King. His brother-in-law Steadfast was also there, and so were Endurance and his wife Willingness, whom you would never have recognized by their old names of self-pity and helplessness. There was the one-time innkeeper, now named Strength, and his wife, Sweet Content, sitting beside him. She was the last to arrive at the high places and was a very recent newcomer. The ex-bank manager, Generous, was there, and so was his lovely wife, Forgiveness. Near them sat Meekness and Lowliness, who had once been pride and superiority. There were also a number of other guests to whom you have not been introduced in the previous pages. They were all gathered around the king and rejoicing with him. This feast day was a very special occasion, for two of the company were on this day to go with the king over the river and descend with him up to the very high places in the kingdom of love. Dear and greatly beloved Mrs. Valiant and her friend Mrs. Thanksgiving were to leave this world and become inhabitants of the world on the other side of the river. So their friends from the valley had come up to the high places to wish them joy and to take leave of them for a little while. How I wish I could adequately describe the scene as they sat there feasting and rejoicing together in the shade of one of the giant aloe trees. The lilies bloomed in the grass around them, and the sweet smell of spices perfumed the air. On one side of the king sat Mrs. Valiant, and on his other side sat Mrs. Thanksgiving, the one-time widow, Dismal Forebodings. She was wearing a still more beautiful shawl than usual, and all the lines of dreary discontent and foreboding had vanished from her face completely, washed away in one of the healing mountain streams. The whole company sat listening to the king as he taught them many things concerning the life over on the other side of the river, and of the many royal mansions on the mountain ranges, which were so high that no human eye could see their peaks. Every now and then there came to their ears the sound of children's voices and their happy laughter, for in a nearby meadow were all the little children belonging to the company. Their parents had carried them up there to one of the king's playgrounds, where they could play together under the loving care of some of the inhabitants of the kingdom of love. There was the child who used to be called Doldrums, and the twins Sob and Drizzle, and their brothers Surly, and also little Tit for Tat. It is lovely to be able to record that up there They all answered to new names and were already beginning to dislike their old ones. They were named after the jewels which gleam in the walls of the king's royal city, and they themselves looked as lovely as jewels as they ran about in the sunshine. On one side of the Mountain of Aloes, near the place where the company were gathered together, there flowed a river, clear as crystal and brimming to the banks, until it reached a place where it must pour itself over the cliffs in a great waterfall to the valley below. When it reached the low places, this river flowed through the valley of shadow, and men called it the River of Death, because down there its waters were dark and icy cold, and those who had to pass through it came up into a part of the valley which was even colder and darker, after which their way vanished between somber mountains, where no eye could follow them. Up on the high places, however, this river was called the River of Life. Those who passed through it up there came straight up out of the waters without their mortal garments into the kingdom of eternal life and love, where there is no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, and no more partings forever. After the company had feasted and rejoiced together for some time, and after the king had finished speaking to them, they sang together one of the mountain songs. Art thou fearful, love will fail? Foolish thought and drear. God is love, and must prevail. Love casts out all fear. We have seen his lovely plan in God's Son, made Son of Man. Holy love could not create, save for love's sake sweet. Therefore we his creatures wait, union made complete. When love's perfect work is done, God and man will be at one. We may know that God is love, know his Father's heart. He hath spoken from above, and our doubts depart. We have seen what hath sufficed in the face of Jesus Christ. After this, the king rose up with a radiant smile on his face, and after blessing them all, he gave one hand to his friend Mrs. Valiant, and the other to his friend Mrs. Thanksgiving, and led them to the banks of the river, and all the company of their friends went with them. The aloe trees growing along the bank cast their shadow on the river, but their branches were full of little birds singing most melodiously. Here then, for a little while, they parted company. The king himself stepped down into the river with his two friends, and led them across to the other side. The brightness over there so dazzled the eyes of the group on the Mountain of Aloes that they could see nothing very clearly. But it seemed to them that the brightness came from a host of shining figures standing on the farther bank, as though a great company of the inhabitants of that land had come down from the very high places to welcome the king's friends. They did see, however, that as soon as they entered the river, the mortal bodies of the two women slipped from them as though they were old, worn-out garments, and were carried away by the brimming waters over the great fall down to the valley of death far below. They thought also that they caught a glimpse of the two radiant and beautiful beings who had lived in those mortal bodies, and who now stepped out free. One, an upright and golden figure, shining as though in polished armor, walked on the side of the king where their friend Mrs. Valiant had been. On his other side was a dazzling white-robed figure, radiant with light. Then the brightness swallowed up everything, and their friends knew that the valley of humiliation would know those two no more. As soon as they had passed from sight, the little company on the slopes of the mountain slowly dispersed and went their different ways. But the two daughters of Mrs. Thanksgiving and her niece, Grace and Glory, and her son, Fearless Witness, stood side by side on the banks of the river a little longer, looking towards the other side where the king had led their loved ones, thinking of those who had gone with him, and of the wonderful things which he had accomplished in their lives. Then they looked at one another, and though there were tears in their eyes, they were smiling with great joy. "It is good to have the treasure of loved ones over on the other side of the river," said Praise. "And we shall go there ourselves in a little while, never to part again," said Compassionate. "And meanwhile," said Fearless Witness, "we have glorious work to do here, so that when the time comes for us to rejoin them on the other side of the river, we shall have trophies to take with us to the praise of the King's grace and glory." Realizing that he had unconsciously spoken aloud a name which had become very dear to him, he looked into the face of his cousin and smiled with a gentleness which one could never have associated with a bully, Craven Fear. It was not Craven Fear standing beside Grace and Glory on the banks of the river, however, but one whom the king had transformed into Fearless Witness, and who had already become a leader in the king's work. Grace and Glory said no word at all, but as the four of them at last turned away from the river bank, she slipped away alone and sat down in the shade of one of the aloe trees, at a place where she could look straight out on the view of the far-reaching valleys stretching away into the dim blue distance. She sat there thinking of many things and recalling the lessons she had learned up there on the 9 mountains of spices, and most of all looking out on those far-off valleys. Presently she saw that the king had returned and was leading Fearless Witness to the same view place, but a little distance away from the spot where she herself sat. She watched them intently as they stood side by side, talking earnestly together, and could see them clearly and hear the murmur of their voices, though unable to distinguish what they were saying. She saw the king point toward those distant valleys, and she noticed how Fearless Witness threw back his shoulders and clenched his hands as if in excitement. She saw how eagerly he seemed to be listening to the king, and then noticed the king lay his arms lovingly across the shoulders of the man who had once been the bully Craven Fear, and whose greatest blemish and weakness was now changed into his greatest strength. She saw the smile of affection and love which the king turned upon him, and she said to herself almost wonderingly, "How the king loves him! I think Fearless Witness is dear to him in a special way. And yet that is the man who fled from him for so long, and whom I hated and feared so greatly." As she sat quite still and stared long and earnestly at the huge scarred form of Fearless Witness, across whose shoulders the king's arms still rested with such affectionate trust, suddenly it was as though the eyes of her understanding were opened, and she understood a truth which she had never before perceived. "Why," she said to herself with a start of surprise, "just see what the king has done. He has made that which seemed the greatest torment and weakness and despair of my life, the thing I most dreaded and suffered from, into the best thing of all. I was always afraid that I must be Craven Fear, because of the fear which so tormented me. He, by his wonderful grace, has changed me into something I could never have hoped to be, a Fearless Witness. Oh, how wonderful the king is! Oh, what lovely plans and purposes he has, that our greatest torments and failures should become the strongest and best things in our lives. Out of weakness, he makes us strong, to wax valiant in fight and overcome. No wonder the king loves him, went on Grace and Glory, after a moment's pause in her thoughts. And then she gave a happy little laugh. Why, I can see that already he is champing like a war horse at the sound of the trumpets to be off to those far-off valleys, and to be witnessing there too. All the energy and strength which he used to put into his bullying is now turned into this new service, and has become his greatest asset. Just as she reached this point in her thoughts, she saw a fearless witness turn to the king and ask a question. Then the king also gave a little laugh, raised his voice, and said so clearly that she could hear the words, "Ask and see what the answer is." Then they both turned and looked around at her as she sat alone in the shade of the great tree. "Grace and Glory," said the king clearly, "come here to us. We want to speak to you." Without a moment's hesitation, Grace and Glory rose and went and stood beside them, and Peace and Joy walked behind her, taller and more regal and beautiful than ever before. "Grace and Glory," said Fearless Witness, "we have been talking about those many far-off valleys around the world where the king needs fearless witnesses." "Yes," said she simply. "We are going to them," said the king. "Will you go with us?" Grace and Glory then put one of her hands into his and the other into the hand of Fearless Witness and said, "Make me all that you wish to make me, my lord, and do with me all that you wish to do." There the three stood together, the two creatures united with the Creator. He was the will to love. They were the response to that will, and the channels through which express that love. Then the king's voice rang out clearly and strongly over the Mountain of Aloes, saying with glad assurance and command, "Ask of me, and I will give you the heathen for an inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession." Psalm 2:8. Before the three turned to leave the mountain and the ranges of the mountains of spices, they sang together a new version of the Jewel Song, Isaiah 54:11. "Here is the sapphire stone, my heart a shining throne, where love himself is crowned as king. Here my obedient will delights to listen till it knows thy choice in everything. Here is the agate gem, the fairest lord of them, my ruby stone of blood and flame. Here is my broken heart, made whole in every part, inscribed forever with thy name. Here is the emerald fair, life breaking everywhere out of the fallen, bruised seed. Here will I praise the Lord, who hath fulfilled his word and given the 100-fold indeed. With what fair colors shine these border stones of mine, like royal banners bright unfurled. Now I go forth, my Lord, strong through thy mighty word, to stake out claims around the world." And that is the end of chapter 18 and the Mountain of Spices. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace. Shalom.